So in setting up the Human Development Index, we have to start by deciding what are the things that we believe are the best measures of whether or not people in a country have an economy that meets their needs. And people have all kinds of needs. You might have a need for art. It's not clear to me that we really want to decide which country is doing best based on the volume or quality of the art people provide. It's important, but it may not be the first baseline we want to begin with when we think about whether or not people are doing well. So the first thing we have to do when we create an index is to actually decide what to include in the index. And in the Human Development Index, they use a concept of basic human needs. So part of what we're going to focus on then is what did they choose. So for the Human Development Index, they chose 3 items. First, they decided, well, clearly, in order for a country to be able to provide well for its citizens, its members, it needs to have the resource base to do it. It needs to have enough actual economic activity, production, income to do that. So the GDP was not a bad thing. It was just an incomplete thing. So let's start there. So we're going to continue to use the GDP as one item in my index. But for example, when we look at countries, we find that there are countries with the same GDP, but in some of them, those GDP resources are being used to provide education. In other countries, they are not. So I would like a way to measure whether or not this country is meeting the basic capacity of training people to function in today's society. Education. And in fact, I can make it even more basic. I can do like, I'm not going to say whether you have PhDs. I just think that at minimum, a country should make sure that people are literate. They know how to read and write, because to read and to write is an essential component of being able to do anything in society. Being able to read whether or not a bus schedule is working, being able to understand prices when you go into a market and somebody has put prices down and you're trying to figure out what that means, being able to read rules that the government puts out, whatever. Reading, writing, literacy is pretty basic. So I can look either at literacy, or I can decide maybe countries should at least make sure people get 8th grade education. People at least get 12th grade education. So we're going to see, when you do the reading, you're going to see the specific measure that was used in the HDI. And then we're going to look at some additional later measures later on, where they use other types of measures in order to figure out education, literacy. So I need a measure for that. And then the third thing I might decide is, you know, if you are meeting the needs of people in your country, then why do we all want growth? We want growth because we want to lead long, happy, healthy lives. Right? We don't want to die of disease. We want to be able to get healthcare when we need. We want nutrition when we need. Right? So maybe one third thing I can look at is look at different countries. They might be equally rich, but in one country the people are living longer. Whereas in another country, even though they are rich, they are not living as long because their healthcare system isn't that good. So the resources, again, are not going where we think it should go, which would be into health. So, and for health, we can again use different kinds of measures. We can use life expectancy at birth. We can use infant mortality. So we're going to have to use some measure. And we are going to come back to those measures in a minute, But before we go any further, I just want you to note that there are other items they could have included, but they did not want to include everything plus the kitchen sink, because then you don't get a very clear picture. So when you do an index, it's really important to make sure that you're not just adding everything and everything and everything and everything to the point where it becomes unwieldy and the number doesn't mean anything at all. Right? So you want to start honing in on the items you want to include in your index. So now you've done that. In this case, we decided just 3, real clear. We now have to decide which measures to use for each one of these. So now that we've got a sense that we're trying to use something to measure our level of wealth, our level of education, which is also a good measure of future possibilities for members of this country, our level of health. Right? We have to figure out what particular measure we will use for each. And in the Human Development Index, when it comes to wealth, what they use is gross national income, which is a little bit different than GDP. They usually go together, but for some countries, if you have a lot of your production done by foreign corporations who take the money out, then even though you're producing a lot, the profit from that is not coming into your own country. So national income is a better measure for us than GDP, which is a production measure. So we're going to do gross national income, and it could be that both countries have the same level of national income, but one country has a much larger population than the other. So obviously that means that in one country, that income has to be spread across a lot more people than the other. So we're going to do gross national income per capita, all right? Per capita gross national income, that's going to be our wealth measure. For education, I'm going to look at average years of schooling. Now, this is a really nice measure because, you know, I want to know, maybe there is a country where on average a lot of people are just dropping out after 6th grade or 8th grade. And then there is a very teeny percent of the population that's going on to become engineers, doctors, lawyers, get PhDs, right? So if I just say what is the highest degree, it's not a very useful measure. So instead, I'm going to look at on average, how far along in schooling, just K through 12, just in schooling, how much education are people getting? Are people dropping off at 6th grade? Are people getting to 8th grade? Are people getting to 12th grade? What's happening to the average population? And then for health, I'm going to use life expectancy at birth. Now, I have to specify at birth because as it happens, your life expectancy tends to vary depending on how old you already are. Because, for example, in some countries, if you make it past age 4 or 5, there's a pretty good chance you'll live a long, healthy life. The danger period is when you're an infant and you can die from malnutrition, infant mortality, and so on, right? So we're going to take your life expectancy at birth. Average person born into this country, once they are born, at time of birth, how long do we think they will live? This is also good because that means I can track it year by year. That if the life expectancy at birth in 1950 was so many years, right? And then they do something, the healthcare system changes, then the life expectancy at birth for that next generation in the 60s or 70s will be higher. So of course, people who were born in the 50s and 60s will also suddenly start living higher because they are also benefiting from this new health regime, right? It's not just the kids who benefit. So to make this annually comparable, it's really important to decide at what point I'm going to choose this life expectancy measure. And I'm going to do it at birth. So I've got my 3 items. For wealth, I'm going to do GNI per capita. For education, I'm going to do average years of schooling. And for health, I'm going to do life expectancy at birth. So now that I've got the 3 items I'm going to look at, and I have figured out what particular measurement I will use for that, I have a problem. I want to combine these 3 things into a single number, right? But one of them is being measured in dollars per capita. One of them is being measured in years of how long you will live. One of them is being measured in average time you will go to school. How am I supposed to combine these? So I need to now convert these numbers into a common scale. And this is where the early work we did on types of numbers, nominal or ordinal interval ratio, is going to be important. We, because it's an index, need to find the right type of number that can be combined. So it obviously can't be a ratio scale because just the units are too different. So we really want to make sure that number is not just nominal because we want some comparison. And we would like it to not just be ordinal because we want it to be meaningful. When we say that this country has so much higher HDI than that country, we actually want that number to have some meaning in terms of how much bigger my HDI number is compared to anyone. So we are going to set up an interval scale. So remember, an interval scale is a very particular kind of scale where the distance between the items is meaningful. It doesn't necessarily have agreed upon 0 that you can use to do the whole range of mathematical operations, but we still do want that distance to be meaningful, right? So the way we are going to set up our interval scale is the following. First, I need the scale. So my range is going to be from the highest number to the lowest number. So if one country has average education as college, so that would be 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years of education. Another country, the country that's doing the poorest, has 3rd grade, 3 years. So my range would be from the highest to the lowest. And then I'm going to see where my country falls inside that range. So I'm going to take the lowest number and I'm going to see how much better I'm doing compared to that lowest number. So this is my range, highest to lowest, and this is where I am inside that range. So see, it's an interval. This is the interval, and I'm finding out where I'm sitting inside that interval. That's why it's an interval scale. And I'm going to make it times 100 so that everything is all going to be aligned nicely on 100. So the country with the highest value, right, would be highest minus lowest, highest minus lowest. It would get 100 points. the country with the lowest value, lowest minus lowest is 0, divided by highest minus lowest is 0. We'll get a 0. Right? And in that range from 0 to 100, I can see where in that interval relative to the lowest and the highest my country is falling. Right? So I will do this for all 3 of my measures. Highest GNI per capita minus lowest GNI per capita, my GNI per capita, lowest GNI per capita. I will do this calculation, multiply by 100, and inside that range of 0 to 100, 0 being the lowest, 100 being the highest, I will find out where my country is inside that interval.